So welcome to the Montebaca lecture this afternoon. If you're able, as we get into the lecture, to mute yourself from your end, please do. If there are any mutes missing, I will come and put them in place in a moment. Great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ralph Lee to give our lecture this afternoon on language and mission in Oriental Christianity. I first met Ralph, I can't quite remember how many years ago, but quite a few years ago, when a friend of mine in Addis Ababa, where I was at the time in Ethiopia, said there's somebody you ought to meet, and took me round to Ralph's home in Addis. And I had the pleasure of meeting him, spending some time with Ralph and his family. And our relationship has continued since then. I was interested in talking with Ralph in Addis there to hear that he had gone to Addis under the Navigators, so a very obviously evangelical organization, to teach chemical engineering. But by the time I got there, he was not just a navigator, but almost Orthodox, and teaching in an Orthodox seminary. So quite a change from a navigator teaching chemical engineering to somebody who has a real love for the Orthodox spirituality and way of life, teaching in their seminary. Ralph has a PhD from SOAS and is continuing his link with SOAS and doing some work there, but lives in Cambridge. He came back there a few years ago, having been in Ethiopia for 16 years, and is now engaged in a number of roles, both with SOAS, with the Theological Education, the Theological Federation of Colleges in Cambridge, and with Cambridge University. Also with OCMS ourselves, leading our Orthodox project here in Oxford, and developing work through that project, primarily at the moment in Ethiopia, but also a connection with Romania, and leading us in that. And Tim, who's on this call today, and myself have had a strong link with Ralph through the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative. And Ralph's been part of the board of that organization for some time. Ralph is an expert in languages in many ways, has studied Gi'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopia. I'm very jealous because I'm still struggling to learn Amharic, the current language of Ethiopia, and I certainly haven't got anywhere with Gi'ez. Is working on a research project in Cambridge on textual history of the Ethiopic Old Testament, and with a particular interest, I think, Ralph, you can correct me, on 1 Enoch. So that's some of the background. But Ralph, we're going to hand over to you now, and you can take us wherever you want this afternoon in your lecture.
Well, thank you for all that. If it's any reassurance, Mark, Gi'ez is a lot easier than Amharic is. Maybe
I should have started there rather than Amharic.
Yeah, you should. They seem to manage to make their language more and more difficult over the centuries rather than easier and easier. So, yes, thank you for that introduction. It covers a lot of the bases, and I have lots of interest in things Ethiopian, and I think also in something that probably Leslie Newbigin said most strongly of all some time ago, of the need for us to listen to non-Western voices as we think about mission and the church worldwide. And also with Kwame Bediako, who many of you will know or know of his writings, who made a strong case for the development of an African outlook on Christology. And after writing his seminal work, Theology and Identity, he did acknowledge when giving a lecture in Ethiopia some years later that there was a chapter missing from that book. Oh, somebody's got some. Yeah, there was a chapter missing from that book, which was really as well as looking at Greek and Syriac early Christianity, he probably ought to have looked at Ethiopian Christianity and its early development of its own Christology. So I feel supported by many people, but also troubled by a broad outlook, which I have shared with several people and not always got a warm response to, which is I feel that in the broad area, as we in some universities teach courses on subjects like, generally under the title of World Christianities, that we're still actually behaving a little bit like Victorian missionaries, or some Victorian missionaries, I should say, not all, in that world Christianity often is put across a little bit like what I would call a Victorian circus, where we have strange animals in cages that make funny noises when we poke them, but they don't actually take seriously, certainly intellectually seriously, many of these traditions. And the Ethiopian tradition is of some interest in this respect because it is so long and so enduring, but also rather impenetrable, not just because of language, but also because a lot of it's not written down. It's an oral tradition, and that brings extra complications. Anyway, what I will do, I've got some slides to share, so I will see if I can make that happen. So if I do that, I should have you. There we go. How's that looking? Are you seeing a slide now? You should be able to just see a slide with.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to start off, and we won't dwell long on this. Let me play this short part of this short I don't have time to dwell on that longer. Some of you, certainly Mark, will be familiar with some of those sounds. What you're seeing is Ethiopian priests and other people singing and dancing chants that in a very special place in Ethiopia, in Lalibela, where the churches are built out of single pieces of rock. The churches are quite old, sort of 800 or 900 years old, but the chant itself possibly dates back to as early as the 6th century. And it's part of an ancient poetic and theological and musical tradition that's unique to Ethiopia. Let's stop that. There we are. So I'm going to start a little bit more broadly. If you came to the last Montague Barker lecture that I gave, you'll remember that I was talking about various aspects of, if you like, what does revival look like in Orthodox Christian communities, and particular in Oriental Orthodox communities. And I looked at churches in India and in Egypt and in Ethiopia, and looked at some trends. And one of the phenomena that we see in all of these churches in one form or another is that as the churches have seen what's undoubtedly some sort of spiritual revival, their interest in their own ancient languages has also revived. Now, this may not be a very complicated phenomenon, but I think there's also more to it than meets the eye. So we'll discuss some broad issues around that first, and then we'll focus in on Ethiopia and what we can begin to learn about Ethiopia's tradition in this respect. So the Oriental Orthodox Christian communities that we know today, and by Oriental I could also mean or be referring to the non-Chalcedonian churches, the churches that grew up mostly outside of the Roman Empire with their origins, although not exclusively. So the churches in Armenia, Georgia, India, Egypt, and Ethiopia, and of course Eritrea. Now it has a separate church. All have this strong affinity. Armenian, and obviously with the Armenian language, Georgia and the Georgian language, which earlier, Mark, you referred to me as an expert in languages. Trying to learn Georgian confirmed to me that it was only God's grace that I'd learnt Ethiopian languages. Georgian completely and utterly defeated me. The professor who taught me told me that Georgian grammar is so complicated that you don't even learn how to say I love you until intermediate level. And it was true. Anyway, the Indian church also has its obsession and interest with Syriac language. Egypt is more complicated because both Coptic and Arabic languages have been significant in its tradition. And then in Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Giz language. Spiritual vitality seems to be often associated with a strong interest in these languages, but there is rarely an interest or such deep interest in the sort of things that get biblical scholars, for instance, excited in the West, which are Hebrew and Greek language. Whilst these ancient languages revive, there's usually a simultaneous development of modern language texts. So this isn't just a sort of obsession with something that's ossified and traditional. For instance, when the Indian church first saw some sort of awakening, probably around about 100 years ago, along with the development of interest in Syriac language and Syriac text came the initiation of Malayalam magazines and newspapers, which were all started by the Christian communities. In Ethiopia, since the 1990s, we've seen a proliferation of texts and books written in Amharic, which are aimed at fostering spiritual growth. As I said, it may not be a complex issue, but it has a significant impact on how we understand the traditions. And it's also true that if we're going to engage with these traditions, then we have to take some aspects of it seriously. In Ethiopia, it's not just the ancient texts as well. Perhaps unusually in Ethiopia, the ancient language is associated with contemporary compositions and activities as well. And that's what we're actually going to focus on in some detail. I beg your pardon, I think I was talking to the wrong slide there, wasn't I? Been through most of that. I think the broad sort of intellectual and cultural heritage associated with these languages is not something that's just associated with texts themselves. And I think it's important to think about the artistic traditions that are also connected with these texts. Here we've got Coptic and Syriac and Georgian and Ethiopian ancient texts, which are of extraordinary beauty. We'll come back to the Ethiopian one a little bit later because it's quite an interesting one. So some basic thoughts on why these languages are important. And again, these are not necessarily going to stun anybody or shock anybody. But of course, early translation of the scripture and liturgy into these ancient languages was a feature of all of these groups. So an early passion for the vernacular has produced these very old translations of the Bible and other material. Some of these, of course, have been inaccessible, and Western scholarship may overlook how early and deeply Christian faith is established and how it forms a spiritual, liturgical, literary, and intellectual culture. And I think this has often led to some missionary movements overlooking significant Christian heritage, which of course could have built opportunities if that hadn't been the case. It does seem that the stimulation of growth and vitality in many of these communities is associated with the coming of Protestant and Catholic mission in the 19th century, where the churches wanted to build some robust defense of their own outlook. And again, that's been written about by many people. I think it's interesting, again, perhaps reflecting amongst some attitudes that are present in all sorts of texts. I think of Adrian Fortescue's informative but rather condescending volume that's entitled "The Lesser Eastern Churches" in his work on the world of Christianity at his time. When we come to Syriac, which is probably the most widely explored of these languages, J.B. Seagull on Ephraim the Syrian, writing in about 1970, having edited and worked on several texts that had been out of reach to many scholars before then, commented that Ephraim's work shows little profundity or originality of thought. His poems are turgid, humorless, and repetitive. So what's going on there? Well, it turns out, I think, and Sebastian Brock is the person who par excellence has turned around the view of Ephraim's works, that Seagull was looking at Ephraim's theology and his outlook very much through Western spectacles, and he missed a great deal. Robert Murray was very much more interested in the tradition and did some of the seminal work before Sebastian Brock, and he was able to describe the same pieces of work and its author as the greatest poet of the patristic age, and perhaps the only theologian poet to rank beside Dante. So we have lots of competing views, but nevertheless, some people saying, well, okay, this is all very interesting, but it's not really very good theology. I think it's important in these traditions to understand how the direction of travel, if you like, is understood. The Holy Spirit, it is understood, has worked in the transmission and translation into, rather than so much the receiving from. And what do I mean by that? In the sense that I'm trying to convey, the translations themselves and the literary culture that develops is understood as inspired, not just the original Greek and Hebrew text. So in a sense, the direction of thought and of analysis is somewhat in the opposite direction from how Western scholarship sees things. So, for instance, critical study is a backwards-looking tradition, one that seeks to go back to the earliest possible versions. And this is not the case in these Oriental traditions, and hence their relative lack of interest in those original languages. So I've mentioned that a lot of work has been done in Syriac, and Sebastian Brock is the person who can best communicate that with you. And if you missed his talk on the Church of the East earlier in this series, it is available, I believe, on the OCMS website now. Syriac and Arabic Christianity of these traditions have received the most attention. Sebastian Brock and many others, but Sebastian is without doubt the preeminent scholar in this area. And Sebastian is also of great interest because he's not only worked as a scholar, but he's worked also within the tradition. The Indian Orthodox call him the Malpuno, and the teacher of teachers. And he holds great respect and reverence amongst the Indian Orthodox and many others in the Syriac tradition because of his work. Sidney Griffith is another preeminent scholar of Arabic Christianity. And again, if you want to start appreciating some of the depth and breadth of theology written in Arabic, then his book, The Church in the Shadow of the Mosque, is very significant. Much work remains to be done in these areas, but also in some of the other languages. My personal interest is in Ge'ez. I know very little Arabic, although I have tried, exploring its tradition and its expression has been something that I've given a lot of my time to over many years now. So thinking something about the language and the tradition, I've put here as an introduction to this section a rather unusual picture. Here is the Ethiopian Saint Yared, who is the person who's believed to have started the tradition that you saw in the chant at the beginning of this talk. Here he's portrayed singing to King Garema Gospels, and you can see that his foot has been pierced by the king's spear, but Saint Yared is in such ecstasy as he sings and worships God that he doesn't notice. If we read the life of Saint Yared, we understand that the music and many aspects of what he writes about, as well as the music that he composes, were revealed to him in a vision, a heavenly vision. And many of the sounds that he uses are evoking natural sounds like bird song and different things like that. Saint Yared would be worthy of a talk all on his own, so I don't wish to go too far into that. I think the sort of ecstatic state in which Yared finds himself with his foot speared but still worshipping God perhaps reflects another aspect of these traditions, which again I don't really have much time to give to today, but the idea of being taken into some sort of better place through the worship, away from this world, perhaps is signified also in this talk. So what about Geer's language? There's a great deal we could say, and here I say very little about the language itself, but for those of you who are less familiar, it is the ancient language of the Aksumite kingdom of Ethiopia. The language was in common use before Christianity arrived in Ethiopia. We don't know exactly where it comes from in detail, but we do know that it has strong connections with dialects of southern Arabia. It's a Semitic language, and it was used in the kingdom of Aksum from its inception. It has been described as a dead language, and I would contest the idea of it being a dead language in some senses. Dead language is defined as a language that's lost its last native speaker. I'm not sure that the conversing and philosophizing and creating compositions in Ge'ez has ever stopped. Certainly currently today, it's a language that is used creatively, and indeed is in some senses developing as a language. That's a strong statement. Its value to broader scholarship has certainly come through early Christian literature. The Bible was translated into Ge'ez by the early 5th century. We don't know that from material evidence. We don't have many manuscripts from as early as that. But it's the survival of 1 Enoch, which I have a great interest in Ge'ez, that points to that, because 1 Enoch had gone out of use elsewhere by the 5th century. So we presume that the Greek version from which it was translated was one of those versions in circulation. The liturgy and various other early works are preserved in Ethiopic. 1 Enoch is important in scholarship more broadly, and so is Jubilees. Those two texts only survive in full in Ge'ez. It's interesting that the scholarly interest from the biblical tradition, for some, is sort of typical, that the Ge'ez is only a sort of stepping stone as a means for recreating some original. So the tradition itself is of incidental interest to many people who look at it. Ethiopia's literary tradition developed significantly with liturgical poetry from the 6th century. We've seen that picture of Saint Yared. We don't have any original manuscripts from this period, but there is every reason to believe that the broader accounts are true. We get significant literary activity developing as well much later. We have a sort of period of what you might call the Dark Ages, simply that we don't know very much about them. But from the end of the 13th century, with the writing of the Ethiopian national epic, Kabra Nagast, that seems to initiate some significant literary activity. And there's what people have referred to as the Golden Age runs from about 1430 to 1520. And then we see Ethiopia go through difficult times with the campaigns of Ahmed Gran and the destruction of many manuscripts and monasteries. Interesting that whilst many manuscripts are destroyed at that time, whilst there's a decline in written works, perhaps after this period, it seems to be associated with the growth of the thriving of the oral poetic culture, and a new wave of translations from Arabic, including commentary on the Bible, including some very important works from the Church of the East. It's perhaps notable, worthy of mention, that Theodore Mopsuestia is one of the most quoted writers in the Ethiopian Bible commentary, which, considering that we have a Miaphysite church, quoting an author so tainted with Nestorianism is quite interesting. We could talk about that at another time, but I think that's a reflection of a very broad outlook in that tradition. Most of the manuscripts we have in Ge'ez are from the 14th century onwards, although there are some notable exceptions. And significant theological works and theological method develops. Interesting, my personal sense is that the Ethiopian literature is something, if you like, with many hidden treasures in it. So in working on 1 Enoch, we discovered a giant story, which is clearly a story inspired by the Enochic tradition, but such stories had not certainly been known of outside of Ethiopia until very recently, and we found this work which uses a story of a giant to explain various things. So we're still discovering even types of literature and approaches to writing that in Ge'ez that are probably very well known within the tradition. Today we'll focus on the poetic tradition, but just in passing, again, referring to the sort of the heritage of the church, I feel it's appropriate to pause for a moment and look at the Garema Gospels. These are the most remarkable manuscripts. They have been carbon dated, so they date from the 6th century. We're very confident of that, and in which case they could easily have been created by or for the founder of the monastery, Abba Garema, where they're still found. They're not in a museum, much to the horror of many Western scholars. They have been used regularly during the liturgy up until very recently. There has been some serious concern during the recent conflict in Ethiopia that the whereabouts of these manuscripts are not known, but that may just simply be because the monastery itself has been inaccessible during the conflict. But I just wanted to show you those. They're very beautiful, and they show something of the richness, not just of the wording of the text, but of the way the language is treated and revered. Here we have Peter remembering Jesus' prediction of his denial and the cock crowing. On to something that's quite different in a way that we'll hopefully spend a few minutes focusing on. I'm going to play you another short video.
ኢትዮጵያ መራን ሰናይ ተመልኪ ፈለጋ እመስኮ በመታዘው ወሰደህ ጋበለው አፈኑ ተወክበት መጽሐፈ ዘህዳጋ እስመ እምዘ እምልብ ሰምረቶ በፈቃደ ስጋ ምስለ አሜሪካ ትሄሉ ህላው የበረከት ወጸጋ እስመ እምዘ እምልብ ሰምረቶ በፈቃደ ስጋ ነው።
I'll stop him now. There you have a contemporary mumher or teacher composing and reciting poetry of a specific kind. What we're going to talk about is Cana. I am not an expert on Cana. I am at the beginning of what I hope is a long investigation of the theological aspects of the tradition. Just some thoughts about Cana and what it represents. The Cana poetic tradition represents the highest level of understanding in traditional education in Ethiopia of the Ge'ez language, requiring complex use of language, both vocabulary and grammar and various aspects. There are various ways in which the poetry conveys meaning, and the first and perhaps the best known outside of Ethiopia is this Samnawork, the wax and gold tradition. Famously, this was, by James Levine, this was described as a way of concealing meaning, which I think is completely the wrong sense. It is a complex system of associations between words that actually conveys meaning and conveys symbolic meaning and connection between things. Hopefully we'll be able to see some of that coming to light. Wax and gold often involves subtle associations in the language. For instance, I celebrate this because it was the first one that I got any idea of in my own study of the language. In the story of Tamar and Judah, when Tamar asked Judah for something as given as a pledge, the word used is helkatetka, the first word, your ring and your skull cap and your rod. The word helkat can also mean your death or your judgment. So when the ring is produced, that was given from Judah rather to Tamar, she pulls it out and she basically says, this is your ring, but she's also saying this is your judgment, with the same word, which I think is quite interesting. Something that couldn't happen and it's rather difficult to translate. You end up having to translate each line several times with all the multiple meanings. There are various other things that we don't have time to go into, but there's a formal set of categories, if you like, of approaches to conveying meaning and understanding. The complexity and the sophistication of these poems makes some of them almost impossible to translate, I think it's fair to say. And perhaps this points to something of why the Ethiopians become fascinated with this theological poetic tradition. In that short video, there was a large crowd of people, many of whom probably don't understand a word of Ge'ez, but they're still fascinated by somebody creating and composing poetry. And of course, the poetry, the meaning of the poetry itself would be explained in a session like that. There are many different styles and schools of Cana that are taught today, each with their own style and approach. Some of them are rather more straightforward, which are the ones I've confined myself to. Some of them are immensely complicated. In common with the Syriac tradition, it is felt that expressing theology in philosophical definitions has a fossilizing effect on any theological inquiry. Rather, the creative opportunities of poetry provides, it is understood, a better way, a more sophisticated and meaningful way to do theology. Many of the songs that are sung during the liturgy may be sung as well, and that's another important part of the tradition that we won't be looking at. The poetry expresses adoration, praise and thanksgiving. It is improvised by people known as Dubtara during the celebration of the divine office, amongst other things. It addresses diverse theological ideas, but celebrates spiritual and secular events and persons. They're used for particular occasions, and they are composed extempore during the liturgy and are never used again. Many are never written down, except for training students. And indeed, for the 2 points during the liturgy where Cana are composed, apparently I was told by a very senior monk that if somebody in the laity recognizes a poem as having been used before, then they're allowed to stop the liturgy and demand another one to be composed there and then. Each of the 7 forms of these poems is associated with a particular style of singing and key. The theological origins are almost certainly in the ancient hymns of Saint Yared, although these hymns do lack the rigid meter and rhyming pattern of Cana, I think the associations of ideas are probably rooted there. The origins of the exact origins are unclear, but they're perhaps associated with the figure in this image on the right. Don't have any photographs of this 15th century figure, but he's known as Giorgious of Gassacher, and he's one of the greatest historical theologians in the Ethiopian tradition. Wrote a book of mysteries which has been described as the Ethiopian Summa Theologica by some. The idea is that the tradition is rooted in the old works of St. Yared are dismissed by many scholars, but I think that's to miss the point. Yared lacked the sophisticated metrical and rhyming structure, although he had his own systems for that, but he did start to build a complex set of symbolic associations that are found in the poetry. With all of this, Cana are found to give room for meditation, for admiration, for questioning of the scriptures, and have content that promotes theological discourse and reflection. So without more ado, because I will run out of time if I wait any longer, we'll go to some poems. I start with one that I don't actually have the gears for. This was translated by a good friend and colleague of mine, Daniel Asefa, and he only was able to provide me at the time of asking with the English translation. Luckily, it was one that could be translated. So here we have what you miss with the translation is the rhythmic and rhyming pattern of the poem. Love of a vineyard caused the death of Naboth. Love of a woman caused the death of Uriah. Neither of the two caused the death of the Christ. However, can we say so? Israel is Christ's vineyard, and the church Christ's bride. So the apparent meaning here is that Christ's death had different causes, perhaps from Naboth and Uriah, but each of these were innocent victims. And then if we're to understand that if a death is associated with a vineyard, then Israel is Christ's vineyard. Christ possessed a vineyard, and being its owner caused Christ's death. So actually, the story of Naboth has a lot to tell us about the death of Christ. And the church is the bride of Christ, and being her spouse caused Christ's death. So in this these few lines, what happens is the bringing together of something focused on Christ and his death and the sacrifice that he gave, but associated with some distant biblical stories. Here's another one that's quite a favourite of mine. And again, why is it a favourite of mine? Well, many of them I just don't understand, so they're not my favourites. This one is a short one, which I think is typical of the sort of approach that many Cana scholars will use. So, Bahatito nabira Ethiopier feraha I haluo noam esma alama angaha. So you see you might not know Ge'ez, but you can see at the end of the two lines of poetry the same Ge'ez letter. God feared being alone, since from the sleep of non-existence he woke up the world. A rather short, snappy sentence or pair of clauses that wonder or promote wonder and marvel at why even the creation took place. Some of us might reel a little bit at the idea that God feared being alone, but the writer isn't trying to be heretical there. He's just trying to penetrate some of the drive and motivation that brought God to create the world. And he wants his listeners to think and meditate on why this happened. I say I should apologize in that there are some very significant Cana scholars, some of the most renowned, who are women, and some of the greatest trainers of modern Cana are women. This one made me laugh, the next one. Salai Melkos fakura walda'a bonu. Zatansaehu mistera asma nababo ba'azanu. So Malkos is part of the group who come to arrest Jesus. These short poems are often aimed at revealing, if you like, part of the nature of Christ. So what we have is the enemy Malkos, a lover of the Father's Son. So he's come and he's had his ear cut off by Peter. Yes. So the writer of this poem says, so he was obviously an enemy. He came to arrest Jesus, but he spoke of the mystery of the resurrection with his ear, because Christ restored his body, having had his ear cut off. So this is quite a slightly comical poem, perhaps, one aimed at creating a smiling response. But what is he really saying? He's saying that in this moment we see something of what Christ has in store for us, because he restores the physical body, even of an enemy. You could spin around those ideas in your head for some time. Another one, this is a really tricky one. It would be almost impossible to translate this in any effective way. You don't get any of the sense. So how was Rogal, Wawolda Nagwadwad, Moati, Kasadia Ahu, Zayita Fataha, Zalati. So this is going to take a lot of unpacking. Rogel glanced, and the son of thunder is dead. I will give my neck to the one who explains this. So this time the NA master is trying to almost spin a riddle. So he's challenging the listener to work out what on earth is he talking about. And this is quite magical, and again shows the way in which the language is used creatively and thoughtfully. So the key here is in the first verb, hawatza. But he doesn't read it as a verb. That verb means to glance. So this is talking about glancing over at something. But what it also is the letter ha, the first letter, which is at the beginning of the alphabet, and then tsa, which is towards the end. It's not the last letter, but it's nearly the last letter. Okay. So using the verb glance joins these two letters with the were, which is a so-called building block letter, just meaning and. So ha, were, tsa. Ha and tsa are the things that are of interest here. So he's joined together two things that are far apart. Okay. Two things that are at the opposite ends, the alpha and the omega, you might say, yes? Rogal is a place which is possibly within sight of Golgotha. What he's doing here is trying to say that whilst the Son of Thunder is dead, that the Son of Thunder is far from death because he died in Christ. And that's the undoing of the riddle. I cannot claim to have undone that riddle myself. I needed that one explaining to me, okay? But I think, again, you see something creative, thoughtful. Every time somebody thinks about that or comes across that verb, the idea is that you would be stimulated to think about these connections. One more, I think we've got time for, and then I probably should stop, shouldn't I, Mark? I'll leave the gears aside, but again, just
muted, Ralph. Yes, you carry on for another 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, great. Just note again, if you don't know gears, it's not necessarily worth reading it, but note at the end of, can you see my cursor on the slide there? Yes, you can. So at the end of the first line here, and at the end of this line here, you can see the same letter. So these there's a strong rhyming element to this poem. So here we go. This is another one which took, I did try to work this one out, and it took me an extremely long time. I actually only finished what I thought about it about 5 minutes before I joined this Zoom conversation. Today is completed the depiction of the image of the changing. Is it not Mount Tabor he lit up while he was on the Mount of Olives? What on earth is this one about? Well, poetic reflections in Cana on the transfiguration abound. They're very, very common indeed. Always referred to as Mount Tabor, and in many ancient traditions, the transfiguration was believed to be on Mount Tabor. Okay, and Mount Tabor is understood to have hidden much more than it revealed. So the nature of Christ is revealed on Mount Tabor, one of the three epiphanies, if you like, of early Christian tradition. In the West, we have focused in on the Magi and their coming as the epiphany. In many Orthodox traditions, the baptism of Christ is the big festival, but the transfiguration itself reveals Christ's nature. And I think, again, what's this poem trying to say? It's trying to join up two important parts of Jesus' life, his teaching and his nature, or his person, if you like. So the significance of what was taught on the Mount of Olives isn't only, if you like, the moral content of the message, but the true nature of the person that's saying it, and the power and authority, if you like, that comes with that. We got time for, oh, that's a hard one. That's a slightly easier one. Let me do that one, and then I'll go to just some short conclusions. This is a slightly longer one of a different form. The short ones are known as the Gubai Cana, or the wedding at Cana, that focus on revealing Christ's nature. This one is Kabari Eti, and is the one of the sorts that's said during the liturgy. So here, with 5 loaves, God satisfied many. Judah, however, did something of greater difficulty. Even though he offered 1 loaf in his meal, as much as the world eats it, it will never be finished, and the one who eats it will never hunger. Sorry, I've just read out the wrong slide there, haven't I? I beg your pardon. That's the one I'm focusing on. Yeah? I'll read that again. With 5 loaves, God satisfied many. Judah, however, did something of greater difficulty. He offered 1 loaf in his meal. As much as the world eats it, it will never be finished, and the one who eats it will never hunger. So this is a simple but powerful connection between the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus, as from the tribe of Judah, being offered as the bread of life. And so actually the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 was small in comparison to this one. Yes, we have 1 loaf of bread that feeds all of humanity and keeps them satisfied forever. So again, the juxtaposition of 2 events, to something around the life of Christ, and then something that happened in the life of Christ, if you like, are joined together and give us some creative and thoughtful contemplation. I've got several others up my sleeve, but I'm going to stop just now. It's fair to say that the masters of this tradition would give you much more from these poems. And in fact, with some of these short poems, I've heard teachers just carry on reflecting and meditating after they've composed them for extended periods of, half an hour, 45 minutes. I think that the creativity and the wonder of some of this tradition gives us a stronger explanation for the fascination with this language. This is not a dead language that represents some ossified tradition handed down over many generations, but this language represents a tradition that is almost impossible to do in other languages. Even the Amharic translations of these poems are just a shadow, if you like, of what you can see with those written in Ge'ez. Many of the reflections of the masters of this tradition are deeply theological, they're pastoral, they're reflective, and they're biblical. I think I also believe, and this is what I'm trying to persuade at least some funders at the moment, that an understanding, a broader study and understanding and appreciation of this tradition would be a blessing for the global church. So thank you. And I'm going to stop the share now and see if anybody has any questions, or whether I've...
Thank you, Ralph, and giving us the riches there, and introducing us particularly to Cana, which I've begun to read a little bit around myself, and found a fascinating area. We're going to proceed as we normally do in these lectures, so if you would like to raise your electronic hand, if you haven't done that before, if you go to the bottom of your screen and look at reactions, just click on there on the right hand side of the bottom of the screen, you'll find that you have a hand there that you can raise. You can even make your hand a different color if you want to stand out. But I'm going to ask you to do that when you have a question ready for Ralph. I don't see any hands at the moment, so I'm going to take advantage of that fact and just come back to you, Ralph.
Yeah.
As I've thought a bit about this myself and listened to you this afternoon, I see the connection here between the crafting of language that Cana does and emphatic theology from the Eastern Orthodox Church, in that it works in the whole area of mystery and of saying that there is so much more to discover than perhaps plain theology. I was an evangelical. I was brought up on Burkett's and other types of systematic theology, which is all done in bullet points and very clear. And there's only 6 things you need to know about the incarnation. Here are the bullet points, which has an advantage in sense of getting things across quickly, but maybe it does damage to the depth of the mystery of God and our relationship with him. I just wondered what your feeling is from your experience in Ethiopia of us moving into a world which is a tweet world. Everything has to be done in, what is it, 28 characters these days, or whatever it is. Sorry, 280 characters.
Yeah.
Twitter. And everything is done in bullet points. And we even use PowerPoint. You've used a PowerPoint this afternoon, which has had, straightforward bullet points. But what about the whole crafting of language and the building in of mystery and getting people to wrestle with finding the meaning rather than having it straight presented to them straight? Will that work in a missional sense in a world that tweets?
It's a good question, although if you tweet in Ge'ez, then you could get 2 Cana at least into a tweet.
Certainly, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, will it work? Well, I suppose I don't know. I think I would agree with the first part of your statement that so systematic theology is useful in creating a framework, but I feel that some of the wonders of the incarnation, and for instance, are almost impossible to express. And in fact, Ephraim was most famously said this, that he actually thought the Greeks were heretics because of their obsession with definitions. And he was asked to write a book. Yeah, he was asked to write a commentary on Genesis. And at the opening of the commentary, he says, well, I didn't want to write this book because I've written it all much better in my poems. He said, but my friends have asked me to write it, so I'm going to write it because I love them. And sort of gives himself up to what's actually not a very, you know, he misses out huge sections of Genesis when he does his commentary. It's obviously not got his heart in it. And then you compare that with one of Sebastian Brock's translations of the poems into English, and I think it's one of the most marvelous lines of theological poetry. It's written as if Mary's speaking, and she says, "This tiny child I carry, himself carries me." Now there's a tweet, isn't it? And in the density of those words, you could, if you like, mull over some of the wonders of the humanity and divinity of Christ in very beautiful ways. So I suppose it's not so much the tweeting. I think that the problem that we face perhaps comes that what we want in the bullet points is all the answers, and this approach in a sense provides us only with a starting point, and it doesn't provide us with answers, because answers are a little bit outside of our reach. But then many good Western theologians would agree with that. I know Thomas Torrance goes to great lengths to explain the difference between apprehending and comprehending God, and that comprehending is something we can't do, because that means embracing, if you like. Just like Ephraim in Syriac, the word for understanding means to have mastery over, and he never used that word of God. So I suppose there's room, but actually what we need in our in many aspects of our Christian outlook, I think, is for people to think. And maybe if we can get some short, snappy ideas presented in ways that really get people thinking, maybe we have something that can work.
So there was a campaign a few years ago by some evangelicals putting very snappy statements, questioning statements on buses in London.
Yes.
And maybe they should be putting Cana there on buses in London.
I think so, yes.
I'm still looking for hands that are up. I'm sure people have questions out there.
Stunned silence, obviously.
Or we have an electronic hand put up physically here from Tim.
Okay, Tim.
I think the brevity can really enhance the ability to think around things. I mean, I'm not as erudite in ancient cultures as obviously you are, but take a Clint Eastwood film. There's a bit where he's releasing a girl and her husband and child to escape from the baddies in the town, and she says to him, "Why are you doing this?" And apparently in the original script there was 2 or 3 pages of dialogue in which he explains his motivation. And Clint Eastwood said, no, just cut it right down. So what he actually says was, because I knew someone like you who needed help. And that's all he says. And it leaves you to kind of speculate on who he meant by somebody like you. And it's far more evocative. The brevity of the thing is far more evocative than nailing it down. And I fully applaud your distaste for definitions. I hate definitions in theses.
I can't remember them. That's my problem. Yeah, I agree. I think, but it takes some creative ability, doesn't it, to create the brevity that does that. I'm only so far with the Ethiopian tradition at a point of being able to marvel at it. I think I've met one foreigner who was composed Cana well, or thought to have composed Cana well, but most people don't. I mean, most people don't have the things in place to allow any appreciation of it whatsoever, I suppose.
I think question in the room here. Sorry, you want to hear me else?
Carry on. Yeah, no, carry on.
Haywan has a question here.
Yeah, since nobody's speaking, I was just wondering who's championing this language and appreciating the meaning of it. Because language is all nuances, right? Like who understands it? And I would love it if Ethiopian scholars explaining although I loved when you read it, you know,
Yes.
it sounds really beautiful, although we don't know if you read it correctly or not.
Right. Yeah, I could have massacred it and you wouldn't have known, apart from perhaps Aditi.
Sure, because I know a lot of Ethiopian friends who came to the West to study Western theology, but I don't know how much. I didn't even like to know the word Cana, you know, until you just told us, right? So I don't know who appreciate, like Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, do they appreciate it or study it and try to share that with the global church?
Well, that's an interesting thing. If we get the funding that we're looking for, we might start doing this. But so I think what's interesting is it's something that's very much associated with the Orthodox tradition, although there is a small but growing number of evangelical scholars who take a great deal of interest in this. So watch out for Sofonita Abera's thesis when it's published. She's successfully defended it in Edinburgh. But a lot of her work was actually looking at the way that this creative tradition has affected the way modern Amharic language is used to do similar sorts of things. People love tricking people with words and making fools of their foreign teachers. So there's that aspect that is growing. So there's a group of people interested in Goethe's literature, particularly at Egust, who I think we know well at OCMS. But within the tradition, I think what's interesting, and this was the thing that that really surprises me. So young, mostly educated people, which there are quite a number in Ethiopia, are wanting to learn this. Early on, when I was trying to learn Ge'ez, I went to a monastery with a group of 5 engineering students from when I was teaching, and I stood in the liturgy and I was reading the liturgy. Now, you're not supposed to read books during the liturgy, although many people do. So this monk came up to me and he said, "What are you doing?" And I explained to him what I was doing. And he said, "That's all right." But he snatched the book out of my hand and he went down the line of 5 students and he hit all of them round the head with the book. He said, "This foreigner's learning this language. What are you doing?" Anyway, all 5 of them signed up for evening classes and learned Ge'ez.
Wonderful, wonderful. No, I really do appreciate you guys working on this, you know, like Sebastian, and I mean, sincerely, but like, yeah, I think we need to see some Ethiopian scholars on this, Yeah,
and I think that there is a real fascination amongst the broader groups associated with the Sunday school movement, for instance, that are really interested in this. And some of them are astoundingly gifted at it. So there is an interest that's very contemporary and quite dynamic. But we don't see it because it's associated mostly within the Orthodox tradition, perhaps.
Sure. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. Either the hand up button is not working on computers this afternoon, or you're all being very reticent in asking questions. I do challenge you, please, to raise your hand and come up with a question.
It's like Dick's wanting to ask something.
I do have a second question, Ralph, which I wrote down while you were speaking. Which
Rose has put her hand up physically.
So we put the hand up, sorry. Oh, Rosemary, right, yes. Rose, go ahead.
You're still muted at your end, Rose. Rose, you're muted.
I think if you're speaking, you need to unmute your computer.
Ralph, as you were talking, I wondered whether you were familiar with the Japanese Christian haiku, which is very similar, which has these very brief and very enigmatic theological statements.
And haiku, of course, is a relatively new creation in its current form, isn't it? Although it's got ancient roots. No, I wasn't aware of that. Be very interesting. Is there anything written on that you know of?
Pass.
I'm going to do some. I'll do some digging. Very interesting.
Ralph, I'm trying to watch for hands. Do put your hand up physically as well, although they're more difficult to see on my screen. So a Zoom hand up is easier for me to spot. But Ralph, while we're waiting, the other question that came up in my mind very early on when you were speaking was you mentioned J.B. Segal.
Yes.
Rather derogative appreciation of Ephraim the Syrian. And I just wondered whether there is a big danger, which we still have really, of trying to read other people's theological tradition through our own tradition. And whether you feel that's ever possible to avoid that. And I make that personal for you. I mean, you arrived in Ethiopia with a Navigators theological tradition.
Yeah.
And yet you seem to have been able to read the ancient Orthodox, the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, not just contemporary, but also the ancient tradition. How do we do that?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think many of the poems that I've looked at today, or most of them, are written by people who we don't know. Some of them we do know the authors of, and I haven't credited them, which I almost certainly should have. And I think it comes back to this idea that for me was forcefully put by Leslie Newbigin, of the need for us to listen. And I think provided it's a two-way conversation, then we're okay. But again, that takes me to the other point that I made, that we have to actually start with an assumption that there's a significant intellectual, creative tradition here, rather than some circus act. Yeah. And that's I think that's the step that you have to take. And this is, I mean, Sebastian Brock has done that par excellence. And as I mentioned when I introduced him a few weeks ago, he's gone to the point of having John Taverner set some of his translations to music, and which I think is quite an accolade. I won't be able to do that, as John Taverner has passed on now, but I doubt if it would happen either. So I think what's interesting is how seriously the scholars that I've met take the interest of a foreigner in the tradition. Yeah, so that in itself says something. That they didn't sort of think, oh well, this isn't for you, this is our stuff. They see it as a richness to be shared, and they see it as a almost an ascetic endeavor to manage to get hold of. So there's no sense I got from many of the scholars that I've met of it being sort of cultural appropriation, or whatever that really means. But at the same time, I'm always limited. A few of these poems where I've managed to translate them, and then I've looked at a scholar's explanation, and I've missed 90% of the allusions that were made, because the allusions were to do with half a word or something like that. So I think it just requires us to be students, not just assume that we understand things, and that's an important outlook as well. But as I say, I think starting with the assumption that there are some depths to be plumbed here is a good one.
Thank you. Dick, we have a question for you, Dick.
Alf, how do you, or don't you, integrate this with your Navigator materials, your bridge and discipleship manuals?
There's a good question. So I have to say, my interest in this has its origins in just wanting to understand the tradition better. So I was, well, let's say I understand. I appreciate that there's a very complex and difficult relationship between, if you like, missionary movements, the Protestant and Pentecostal churches in Ethiopia, and the Orthodox Church. And I don't want to diminish that. But I think one of the things that surprises me, and this is almost partly because of the outlook of the Emperor Haile Selassie himself, when he allowed mission to start thriving in Ethiopia, he basically felt, SIM was sent to the south of Ethiopia, where the Orthodox Church wasn't terribly strong, and to a certain extent, perhaps with the idea to pacify the awkward natives there, who were some of whom were pagans. Now, interestingly, with tribes like the Giorgios, who were famous for their violence, it's fair to say that that was a successful endeavor from the point of view of the country, because the Giorgios were famous killers, and they're much less so, or even not so nowadays. What that allowed certainly missionaries to feel in their outlook was that the Orthodox Church was somehow irrelevant, because it wasn't a big feature of their early experience in Ethiopia. And that's almost the worst possible and most incorrect assumption or conclusion that you could come to. So even if you don't like the Orthodox Church and have good reasons maybe for that, to say that it's irrelevant really is not very intelligent. Yes, because it has been the primary, if you like, forming force on the culture of much of Ethiopia, perhaps particularly the north. So I think to start off with it saying, well, I'm interested in this, I want to understand it. I don't want to assume that 1700 years have passed by without anything significant coming out of this tradition. And if I want to try and work with that, if I want to help Christians grow, I need to understand something of that. So that, it's as simple as that to start with, I suppose. And then you start coming in with some of your Navigator ideas. If those of you familiar with the Navigators, we had a sort of statement that was developed called the Core, which represents the core values of the Navigator movement. And the small group of us involved with Orthodox Christians actually rewrote that to try and convey the same meaning to Orthodox Christians. It was never published, but I've got a record of it. But the idea was to say, well, okay, there's a slightly different outlook here that we need to understand and be at least sensitive to in order to engage constructively. So, I'm happy to say that there are parts of Orthodox theology that still I find difficult. But then there's parts of Protestant theology that I also find difficult as well. So, and I think I am convinced that from my experience of the godliness and generosity of the lives of many Orthodox Christians, that we are part of the body of Christ together. So that means then there's something further to do, which is why I think I'm involved with LOI and all that stands for, because I think that we're missing something in the church by not understanding each other well. And all of this I feel is consistent with what I started off with in the Navigators. There are probably some Navigators that disagree with me too.
Hey Ralph. Hey Ralph.
Yes.
Just to give you a hard time, okay?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. What is, like, I really do appreciate your posture of learner, right? Like there's something to learn from them, and they have something to share to the global church, right? But if there's any like one negotiable, non-negotiable theologically, what is that? It sounds like to me, coming from the Navigator background, that, absolutely, if they don't believe X, then I cannot, call them Christians, right? Like, yeah. So what is that for you? Just to give you a hard time. Give me.
That's fine. Well, I think the Nicene Creed's quite a good start, isn't it?
All right. Okay.
And we'd be on this. We're okay with it. I think I mean, I think a lot of it's down to grace. Let's think about how somebody who looks at Orthodox Christians might perceive. So I think it's undoubtedly true that many of the people I've encountered in the Orthodox Church are in some sense trying to earn their salvation. But then I've learned over the years to reflect back on my own tradition or where I've come from and realize that that's also probably true for many. The question would be, is the church trying to help people to move to understand grace? And I think, again, I've had the most astounding encounters of grace through some of the traditional scholars. I remember an experience I had. One of the young students who was in a small home group with Sarah, my wife, and myself. And he really struggled. A lot of Ethiopian Orthodox Christians struggle they fear taking Holy Communion because they fear taking it in vain, and that this would result in their condemnation. And this is very common. So we went for a weekend to a monastery. In fact, this guy. This is the monk who is the abbot of the monastery, who's one of the godliest men I've ever met. And I said to this young student, well, I think you should ask, his name is Abi Ababi, Father Happiness. I said, you need to ask him, what should you do about taking communion? And the whole weekend, this student, Daniel, his name was, didn't ask the question. Anyway, we ended up driving back to the city together with the Abi Ababi. So I asked him, I said, what do you do? What happens if you take communion and then you fall into sin, which is the classic fear? And he looked at us as if we were stupid and said, well, you repent and you take it again. Yes. So within that context, that's basically saying, yeah, the Eucharist is all about grace. It's not about being worthy to take it. It's about receiving worthiness from Christ. So I think whilst perhaps always expecting a very works-based outlook from people, my experience was that I didn't find that as often as I would expect. But I think I can also, as I say, look back at my own tradition and feel that many people haven't really understood and grasped grace there, and that's why navigators work in Britain as well as in Ethiopia, I suppose, and other people, because that's really what matters. So grace would certainly be non-negotiable. There's lots of other complicated, probably the hardest thing for most Western evangelicals is not just the saints, but particularly Mary and Saint Mary and things attributed to her. And I've had it said to me by this man himself. He said, at a meeting I was at, he said, we Ethiopians, we have Saint Mary in our bones. He says, but many of us have forgotten about the Lord Jesus Christ. And so he's also acknowledging that there's a problem, that some people undoubtedly worship Mary, but that's not the teaching of the church, but it is the practice of some. You see what I mean? So I think what you find when you start unpicking the layers of this sort of tradition, the poems and the commentary and things, you find that the church teaches something quite different from what some people live out. So does that answer your question? It's an extremely important.
Thank you. Yeah.
We're coming towards the end, so last chance if anybody has a hand to raise, either on screen, I can see on screen quite clearly now, or electronically. Sibi, you're unmuted. You're going to ask a question. Yes, and a hand.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for your lecture. And I think Orthodox Christianity and Islam have similar views in many areas, especially language is one of them. And what are some of the theological significance behind Orthodox understanding of their traditional language, and how do they view the authority of revelation in other language other than the original or traditional languages?
Yeah, I think there's another Montague Barker lecture in your question there. Baker. So yes, I think that's interesting. So there is perhaps some similar outlook towards Islam, although it has to be said that whilst the language itself is cherished, it is meant to be understood in a way. So it's very important that even if they're shadows of the original, that people understand what the poem's trying to get at. So understanding really matters. Again, it partly depends on who you speak to. So there's a very many, if you go to rural monasteries in Ethiopia, you have people, many of whom have not often traveled to Addis Ababa, let alone out of the country. So their perspective on what the world is very different from many of us who have traveled and had experience of many cultures. So sometimes I felt that there's perhaps a poor vision for the worldwide movement of God. But I have to say, amongst some of those who you might think have had a sheltered background, a very strong appreciation because of an understanding that says, well, if this hasn't gone around the world, then it doesn't represent what I believe it to be. So I think the biggest tension in understanding this comes where you have, as happened in Eastern Europe, with its own slightly different ramifications, where you get another movement coming in, and the outlook of modern evangelical movements and the Orthodox are very different in terms of jurisdiction and all sorts of things. And I think that's where the tension is felt most. I've been fascinated by how the view of evangelicals has developed over many years amongst my friends. I had another young student who I won't name, but he was a lovely guy, and I appreciated his growing the growing depth of his walk with God in his life. But he had absolutely no time for Protestants. He you know, I wouldn't want to talk to him about Protestants because he never had a good thing to say. Anyway, the last time I went to Ethiopia, I met him and we chatted. And he said to me, "Oh, Ralph," he said, "I have to share my office with a Pente." So all Protestants are called Pente by the Orthodox. And I was thinking, oh no, you're going to go on about Protestants again. And he said, "But you know, Ralph," he said, "he's really like the Lord Jesus Christ." Mm-hmm. So he had learnt over years to see the work of God in people from another tradition. So I think there's a process that needs to go on here. A church, particularly perhaps in Ethiopia, that has in some ways been a little bit cut off from most of the world, but one that's then learning to engage with and understand. That's not universal, but it is present. And I find it most among the masters of the traditional theology of the churk. There you find grace abounding towards and vision about the work of God throughout the world. I don't know whether I've answered your question there, but
yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Well, thank you for a rich blessing this afternoon.
Thank you.
And it's been wonderful to hear all that. I'm going to ask a question, but not allow you to answer it. It's just as a takeaway for us to all think about, really. And that is that traditional scholarship in Ethiopia and the whole tradition of Cana is very much tied up with ascetic lifestyle. And I just wonder, as we move into an era when Ethiopia is going to be more and more modernized, more and more influenced by the West, people become middle class, how it will transform into that setting. So I think that's a missional question for the future.
Very good. Very good question.
Can I remind everybody that last week we had a bit of difficulty with the lecture, and so next week we're going back to Alison Kolosova, who'll be with us. And you remember that those of you with us last week, that she's talking on Nikolai Ilizminsky missionary to the Turkic and Finno-Ugric peoples of Russia, Central Russia, in the period before the revolution. And she started what was going to be a very interesting lecture last week, and then we got cut off. So we have put better technology in place this time. We have a backup recording as well, in case the lines go down. So do join us 19th October next week for the next lecture in this series. And Ralph twice put in a fundraising bid during his talk today for the project. So if any of you know funders who would love to fund this work and more research into what the Orthodox Church has to offer to all of us, do be in touch with Ralph.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Ralph, thank you very much. And,
thank you. Bye-bye.